I couldn't resist when I heard it. An uncontrollable desire came over me. It was wonderful. My name is Laura, and today I've plucked up the courage to tell you my little secret. For a long time, my life seemed like something out of one of those Happy Families commercials. My husband Daniel and I had everything we needed: a simple routine, a cozy home, and the certainty that we were in control. But life, as unpredictable as ever, decided to turn our world upside down. What was once security turned into instability, and I realized, in the harshest possible way, that no one is prepared to lose everything. Daniel worked for a respected multinational. The company was his second home, and he always came home full of stories from work. But one day, he arrived differently. His eyes were downcast. His hands were shaking as he placed his keys on the table. "They've closed the branch," he said, his voice sounding distant, as if he didn't believe his own words. I stood there, unable to respond. It was the kind of news you think only happens to other people. At first, Daniel seemed determined. He spent his days sending out CVs and talking on the phone, saying he had everything under control. But time was cruel. The rejections came one after the other, and each no seemed to take away a piece of the confident man I knew. He avoided my eyes when I asked how the interviews had gone, answering with a silence that hurt more than any words. The bills started piling up, and our stability turned to dust. I had to cancel the TV package and sell some furniture in hiding without telling him. But the first time they cut off our electricity was a blow that was hard to hide. We tried to turn the evening into something romantic, having dinner by candlelight, but inside, my heart was tight. Each day brought a new loss. The car was repossessed, and our once comfortable life turned into a string of painful compromises. Daniel didn't handle it well. He would spend hours on the sofa, lost in thoughts that I couldn't reach. Fights began to break out almost inevitably. "I won't take a handout," he once shouted when I suggested we ask his family for help. I knew he was feeling humiliated, but with each outburst, our marriage seemed to crack a little more. The lowest point came when I had to get water from my neighbor's house, Mr. Carlos. He was discreet, a man of few words, but always attentive. "If you need more, just let me know," he said, with a calmness that almost made me cry. The humiliation of depending on others was suffocating, but we had no choice. I tried to remain optimistic, but at night, alone, fear consumed me. How far would this go? Would we be able to get back on our feet, or would we end up lost in this abyss? And above all, what would happen to us? The love we had seemed to be dissolving under the weight of a reality that was slipping out of our hands. Mr. Carlos had been our neighbor for years, but he had always been a reserved figure. A man of about 60, with neatly combed gray hair and a quiet demeanor. He didn't talk much, but his gaze seemed to take in everything around him. I knew he noticed our difficulties. It was impossible not to notice when we started getting water from his tap almost every day. On one of these occasions, while I was filling the bucket, he appeared. There was no intrusion or indiscreet questions. He just said in his calm tone, "If you need more, just ask. And if you want, I have some chores here at home that you could help me with." I was speechless. The offer was unexpected, but full of kindness. I returned home with a troubled mind. I knew Daniel wouldn't accept the idea. He couldn't bear the thought of depending on others, let alone me working for another man. Still, the bills kept coming in, and our marriage was hanging by a thread. Over dinner, I decided to tell him. I chose my words carefully, but it was no use. He exploded. "I won't let you work for a neighbor. What will people think?" he said, slamming his hand on the table. The discussion was long and painful.
Click like now and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this.
Daniel was consumed with pride, and I with worry. But deep down, he knew we had no choice. When he finally gave in, it was more out of resignation than agreement. He barely looked at me when I whispered that I would accept the offer. The next day, I went to Mr. Carlos's house. It was an organized but simple place. The chores were easy: cleaning a few rooms, organizing old papers, and taking care of little things that he no longer did with the same agility. He was polite, always careful how he treated me, and paid on time. The money brought immediate relief to our finances, but the emotional impact was greater. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over our situation. Daniel, although still uncomfortable, began to accept the new dynamic. The fight subsided and the house became a little lighter, But something unexpected began to grow in me. Working at Mr. Carlos's house was more than a practical solution. It was an escape, a space where I could breathe away from the constant tension of home. I couldn't explain exactly what it was, but Mr. Carlos's attentive gaze seemed to see beyond what I was showing. Working for Mr. Carlos brought a sense of relief that seemed impossible just a few months ago. The money was enough to cover the most urgent bills, and the atmosphere at home began to change. Daniel, although still uncomfortable, stopped complaining, and the fights that used to be constant became rare. But even as the feeling of stability began to return, something unexpected started to happen inside me. The work at Mr. Carlos's house was simple: cleaning the rooms, organizing a few things, and sometimes even preparing a cup of coffee that he insisted on sharing with me. He was a man of few words, but there was something about his presence that began to catch my attention. One day, while sweeping the living room, I felt him watching me. I glanced over, and there he was, standing in the doorway, with that look in his eye that seemed to be trying to decipher something. At first I thought it was all in my head. Maybe he was just distracted, or maybe it was his usual way of looking. But as the days went by, I began to notice that his eyes lingered longer on mine. They were long looks, charged with something I couldn't identify. It unsettled me, but it also aroused a curiosity that I didn't want to admit even to myself. Little by little, Mr. Carlos's presence seemed to grow. He began to appear in the room while I was working, engaging in longer conversations. He would talk about his youth, his travels, and the loneliness he felt after losing his wife. His voice had a serene tone, and each story seemed to bring him a little closer to me. It was as if, with every word, he was trying to build a bridge between us. I didn't know what to feel. There was something comforting in his kindness, but also something disturbing in his gestures. One day, he held my hand longer than necessary as he handed me my payment. My heart leapt, but I quickly dismissed it, pretending not to notice. Try as I might, I couldn't shake the thought that something was changing, not just in him, but in me. Carlos, with his calmness and attention, seemed to fill a void that I didn't even know existed. It was wrong to think of him like that, and yet I couldn't help it. That morning, everything seemed as usual. I had finished the chores at Mr. Carlos's house earlier, and before leaving, I decided to use the shower. It was an arrangement he had suggested a few days earlier, noting the difficulties with water at home. He always left the key to the outside bathroom available, and I was mentally grateful for the privacy of that simple but welcoming space. I let the hot water relieve the tension in my shoulders. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to forget my worries, the daily struggle, and even the looks Mr. Carlos had been giving me lately. But then I heard the sound of footsteps. My heart raced. Before I could react, he opened the door, clearly unaware that I was there. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed eternal. He turned around immediately, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you were here." He closed the door as quickly as he opened it, but not before I saw the embarrassment on his face. I stood there, motionless, feeling the warmth of the water mixed with a wave of something I couldn't name. When I left, he was in the living room, sitting and staring at the floor. He looked like a man who was trying to find the right words, but knew that none would be enough. "I didn't mean to," he said, looking up. I just shook my head, unable to say much more than, "Fine." After that day, something changed between us. His gazes, once discreet, now seemed to seek mine out with greater frequency and intensity. The silent tension that had arisen between us became almost palpable, as if every gesture carried a hidden meaning. And to my own amazement, I realized that I was thinking about him more than I should. The memories of that moment wouldn't leave me alone. His reaction, so genuine, made me question what he really felt. And even more disturbingly, it made me question how I felt. His attentions, his gestures, and even the calm tone in which he said my name began to take up more and more space in my mind. I tried hard to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just the weight of the situation, a reflection of the loneliness that surrounded me at home. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Every time he approached, I felt my heart racing, a nervousness that should never have existed. Something was changing, and I didn't know if I had the strength to stop it. That afternoon, while organizing some old papers at Mr. Carlos's house, the conversation took an unexpected turn. He had always been a reserved man, but that day he seemed more willing to share. He talked about the loneliness he had felt since his wife had left. He told the stories with a tone of longing, but also with a sincerity that touched me deeply. "It's been a long time since I've had company for a decent dinner," he said, with a smile that seemed shy but genuine. "I'd like you to accept an invitation to dine here with me, if it's no trouble." I was speechless. There was nothing in his voice or the way he spoke that sounded inappropriate, but I still felt a knot in my stomach. His proposal was shrouded in kindness, as if he just wanted to break up the lonely routine. But something in me hesitated, as if accepting this invitation meant opening a door to feelings I had been trying to ignore. I returned home with a restless mind. Daniel had gone away on business, and the silence in the house seemed heavier than ever. I tried to occupy my mind with household chores, but thoughts of Mr. Carlos came back with full force. His voice, his looks, the way he seemed to see beyond what I was showing him. As I washed the dishes, I found myself imagining what that dinner would be like. I knew it was dangerous to harbor these thoughts, but it seemed impossible to control. His company was comforting in a way I couldn't explain, and that scared me. It wasn't just loneliness that drew me to him, but something deeper, something I was afraid to face. With every step through the empty house, the temptation grew. Was it so wrong to accept? He had only been kind, nothing more. But the weight of this justification wasn't enough to silence what my heart was beginning to yearn for. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to decide what to do. I felt like I was walking on the edge of a cliff, knowing that a single false step could change everything. The question was I ready to deal with the consequences? The next morning, I woke up determined. I had spent the night fighting my thoughts, but deep down, I knew what I was going to do. I chose an outfit that balanced simplicity and elegance, something that made me feel safe, but without looking like I was trying too hard. I wore a light perfume and tied my hair up casually, leaving my face more open. As I looked in the mirror, I felt my heart racing. It was just dinner, I kept telling myself. Just dinner. When I arrived at Mr. Carlos's house, the look on his face showed his surprise. His eyes ran over me in a subtle but perceptible way, and he opened the door with a warm smile. "You look beautiful," he said hesitantly, as if afraid of crossing some invisible line. My face flushed, but I thanked him, trying to keep my composure. The table was carefully set, with a welcoming simplicity. Candles added a touch of intimacy to the atmosphere, and the scent of home-cooked food filled the air. He poured wine, and little by little, the initial tension gave way to light conversation. We laughed about stories from the past, shared dreams, and even discussed movies and books we loved. He had a unique ability to listen, to make my every word seem important. But in the midst of that comfortable moment, I couldn't ignore the fine line we were crossing. Every time our gazes met, there seemed to be something deeper, something we both understood but avoided mentioning. At the end of the meal, he served coffee and we settled down in the living room. The closeness between us seemed to grow with the silence. He leaned over to pick up a book on the table, and for a moment our faces were too close. My heart raced, but he pulled away, maintaining the respect he had always shown. That night, I realized something that scared me and comforted me at the same time.
Like and subscribe now so you don't miss out on new stories.
Being with him felt good. It was as if his presence filled something empty inside me, something I didn't even know existed. But at the same time, I knew that this was a dangerous path. Even though no explicit gestures were made, the tension between us grew, like a rope that could snap at any moment. As I said goodbye at the door, he held my hand for a second longer than necessary. His touch was light, but full of meaning. "Thank you for coming," he said, with a smile that seemed sincere, but also full of something else. I left his house with a divided heart. On the one hand, I knew I needed to get away before it was too late. On the other, I felt that something had already changed. It was a quiet evening when I said goodbye to Mr. Carlos. I thanked him for dinner and took a step towards the door, but he followed me as he always did. His presence so close no longer seemed uncomfortable, but this time, there was something in the air that was impossible to ignore. We sat in silence for a few moments, and when I turned to thank him again, he leaned in. The kiss was unexpected, but gentle, filled with a tenderness that seemed to contain a lifetime of repressed emotions. There was no rush, just a moment that seemed suspended in time. My heart raced, and a wave of heat ran through my body. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Daniel, my complicated life, and even who I was supposed to be. When we walked away, he didn't say anything, and I couldn't find any words either. His gaze, intense and full of meaning, said more than any explanation. I just nodded, an almost automatic gesture, before walking out the door. As I walked home, I felt like I was carrying a new weight, something I didn't know if it was regret or a spark of something I didn't want to admit. Back at home, the silence seemed deafening. I sat on the sofa and stared at the floor, reliving every detail of that moment. The touch of his lips, the way he held me carefully, and the feeling that, in that instant, the whole world had disappeared. But with that came doubts. I knew what that kiss meant. It wasn't an empty gesture, much less a casual mistake. It was the beginning of something I didn't know how to handle. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend it never happened. But another part, perhaps more sincere, didn't want to forget. The following days were a mixture of anxiety and confusion. Every time I closed my eyes, the moment came back to me, making me question what I was really feeling. Why had it touched me so deeply? Was it just neediness, the fruit of a frayed relationship with Daniel? Or was there something else? Something that connected me to Mr. Carlos in a way that I wasn't ready to understand. I tried to find answers, but they wouldn't come. All I knew was that, after that kiss, nothing seemed the same. Mr. Carlos's affection and attention, which before had only seemed like kind gestures, now had a completely different weight. I was faced with a choice. Continue denying what was happening, pretending that my life was still the same, or accept that that kiss had changed everything. I knew that whatever my decision, the consequences would be profound. But deep down, I also knew that I no longer had complete control over my own feelings. This is my story so far, and I'm in a whirlwind of emotions. I don't know how to move on or deal with everything that's happened. What would you do in my place? Would you choose reason or desire? Would you be able to resist? Or would you let yourself go? I want to know your opinions in the comments. Like and subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters of this journey that changed my life. Your words can help me find my way.
This story doesn't end here. Listen to it all by clicking on the exclusive playlist on the right, or click on the video on the left and listen to the best story on the channel.